Welcome to a future-focused history video titled What Every History Teacher Needs to Know But Isn't Told. I'm Mike Maxwell. Since you're watching this, you are likely a history teacher, or maybe you want to become one. You're not in it for the big bucks. You may be in it because you personally find history interesting, or you think history can enlighten us about the workings of the world, and quite possibly both reasons apply. And you likely want to make a positive contribution to society by becoming a teacher. You want your work to be meaningful. Well, amen there, brothers and sisters. Our hearts are in the right place. But we walk into history education essentially blind because the history education profession remains largely silent about the most fundamental aspects of the field, like its basic purpose and what kind of history we should be teaching. I can think of no other profession that would send new hires into such an important job lacking such basic information. The history profession doesn't tell us these things because it doesn't know what to say. It's in a difficult transition period, moving away from the old way of doing things, which doesn't work anymore, to a newer vision that has yet to take shape. In the meantime, history education is in limbo and floundering about in our schools and colleges. The old way of teaching history came naturally, and it was reasonable for its day. History teachers introduced students to the important events of history in the hope that students would gain historical perspective, a sense of history. The idea was that students and the adult citizens they would become would acquire a long view of the human or national experience. They wouldn't leave school hobbled by the limited vision of reality that comes with having only a present-centered vision of the world, the province occupied by most of the rest of schooling. But things were different back in the mid-20th century. There was far less history to teach back then because it was pretty much limited to our own country, maybe Western civilization, and it was mostly limited to the doings of the old white men who ran things. Since then, history education has expanded to acknowledge the presence of the rest of the world, the existence of women and minorities and ordinary folks, which is a good thing, but in the process, history became too big to teach. History textbooks grew huge, heavy, expensive, overwhelming students with too many topics and details to be absorbed in any kind of meaningful way. History content standards experienced a similar explosion of factual material. Trying to teach all those facts made it impossible for students, and even for many teachers, to grasp history as a whole anymore, to acquire that valued sense of history, that long view of human experience. History education lost its focus, its reason to exist. It became aimless, ineffective, boring. There's no way we can turn back the clock to an earlier time and pretend once more that the rest of the world and the rest of humanity don't exist or don't matter. A connected, interdependent world makes that impossible. At the same time, we can't teach all the facts in those big, boring textbooks, although advanced placement history courses are still flogging that worn-out horse. So how do we move forward from our current state of impasse? A number of educators have given it the old college try. One approach combined natural history with human history to produce big history. Most other approaches, however, de-emphasize the acquisition of historical knowledge, abandoning the old goal of developing in students historical perspective in favor of pursuing other objectives, such as fostering in students feelings of empathy for people of other times and other places, or involving students in meaningful projects, or teaching students historical thinking skills based on the job skills of professional historians. Such widely varied approaches and objectives haven't coalesced into a coherent vision of school-based historical learning. In recent years, history education has devolved into an unfocused mishmash of various teaching strategies that can range from the detailed coverage model traditionally favored in AP courses to a random smattering of historical topics chosen by various teachers to elaborate pie-in-the-sky structures of vague thinking processes. Consequently, fundamental elements of history education remain a mystery to those people charged with the responsibility for teaching it to the next generation, which is an ongoing tragedy because history is a fundamental realm of human knowledge, alongside math, language, and science. It's the realm that deals in human affairs, and it is the actions of humans that will determine the fate of our species. Think wars, nuclear weapons, global warming, universal digital surveillance, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, all dictated by human behavior, which is the stuff of history. Teaching history is not and should not be a trivial matter to be taken lightly. History educators owe it to our society and our species to develop a focused, useful, and effective approach to historical learning. What follows is a rundown of a half-dozen fundamental elements of history education that are seldom mentioned, much less addressed or decided, leaving history teachers in the lurch. After a brief discussion of each of these elements, I'll offer some working suggestions to consider. Basic element of history education, number 1. History education is fundamentally different from other school subjects. Formal education, or schooling, exists to provide knowledge that can help students and society to function effectively in the future. It exists to provide useful knowledge. All school subjects, other than history, pursue this goal by identifying and teaching general principles derived from the subject matter of their particular discipline. Principles such as addition and subtraction in mathematics, punctuation and grammar in language, and photosynthesis or gravity in science. These are all general principles that can be applied in the future to help students and society to function effectively. History education, by contrast, describes one-time events from the past instead of identifying principles from history that could be applied in the future. When history education lacks knowledge that can be applied in the future, it is unable to perform the basic function of education. Suggestion: we could teach students about recurring dynamics of history that have repeated multiple times over a span of years, often over millennia. Recurring dynamics of history can identify more than similar events that have repeated over time, such as wars or financial meltdowns. They can also identify ongoing tendencies of human behavior that lead to calamities like wars and financial meltdowns. Recurring dynamics of history are history education's equivalent to the general principles that form the basis of instruction in other school subjects. Basic element of history education, number 2. History education lacks a coherent purpose. Why study history? The most common answer is to learn about the past. But this answer begs the question, why learn about the past? Lots of people have come up with all kinds of lofty and vague answers to that question. It provides a moral sense, materials of future wisdom, and social glue. It fosters empathy, open-mindedness, tolerance, patriotism, and so on and so forth. So many different reasons to study history amount to no coherent reason to study history. And it's exceedingly difficult to succeed at an endeavor when you don't know what that endeavor is trying to accomplish. Suggestion: a number of smart people down through the ages, from Thucydides 2,400 years ago to Diane Ravitch today, agree that the primary purpose of historical learning is to inform judgment in human affairs. What are practical means for informing judgment in human affairs? Well, we could teach students about the recurring dynamics of history I mentioned, or we could offer students a comprehensible overview of human development through time, but a much more focused and concise version of the old approach meant to develop in students a sense of historical perspective, a modification that would represent a reasonable middle ground between trying to teach everything or teaching just a few random topics. Basic element of history education, number 3. History education doesn't identify the body of knowledge to be taught. All other school subjects have a generally accepted body of knowledge for students to learn, knowledge based on important principles derived from that discipline's subject matter. All general physics classes, for example, will likely cover Newton's laws of motion, gravity, atomic structure, wave motion, electromagnetism, and so on. What do all U.S. or world history classes cover? It's anybody's guess, because there is no generally recognized body of knowledge for history students to learn, and history teaching is all over the place. Teachers don't know what they should teach, so students in one school or part of the country may receive a very different history education from students in another school or part of the country. Suggestion: it would make a whole lot of sense for a respected history education authority to put together a brief list of important topics to be covered in U.S. or World History Survey courses. A list completely different from the excruciatingly detailed and esoteric National Standards for History released in 1994 that died of their own massive weight, so that students across the country and our future citizens would have a basic shared knowledge base. Individual classroom teachers should still be free to add topics based on their interests, local circumstances, and the interests of their students. Basic element of history education number 4. Thinking skills can't replace historical knowledge. Some history educators have suggested that historical knowledge really doesn't matter much, that the point of history teaching should be to teach students thinking skills. Thinking skills, if focused and practical, can be a valuable addition to a school's subject, but they cannot serve as the foundation of the course for the simple reason that thinking is knowledge dependent. Useful thinking requires useful knowledge to think about. First comes the knowledge, then may come the thinking. Not only does knowledge inform thinking, but a common purpose of thinking is to develop knowledge. Knowledge and thinking are partners that work together to advance our understanding. Basic element of history education number 5. History education ignores the science of learning. Cognitive science has long recognized the essential elements needed for successful long-term acquisition of school knowledge, and it's not superficial coverage of large quantities of facts, which is just pretend learning. Real learning, the successful transfer of school knowledge to life beyond school, requires deep learning of a limited number of important principles and concepts encountered in multiple contexts over an extended period of time. Suggestion: where can we find history education's important principles and concepts? This suggestion may come as no surprise. Perhaps they can be found in important recurring dynamics of history, which are history education's equivalent to the general principles that form the basis of other school subjects. And perhaps they can be found in a concise overview of human development through time that emphasizes crucial historical concepts, such as the development of agriculture, the invention of writing, the great voyages of discovery, the Industrial Revolution, world wars, and so on. And perhaps such an overview could provide multiple contexts for learning about recurring dynamics of history, and perhaps all these major historical ideas could be reinforced over an extended period of time if they were revisited in different history courses over multiple years of schooling, much as important principles and concepts of language or math are revisited over multiple years of schooling. Basic element of history education number 6. History education has been undergoing decline for decades. This sad truth is rarely acknowledged out loud, but here are 2 pieces of evidence among many that provide some flavor of the situation. In 2012, the American Historical Association reported the systematic teaching of history had all but ended in elementary schools across the country. In 2018, the AHA observed, of all major disciplines, history has seen the steepest decline in the number of bachelor degrees awarded. Why has history education long been in decline? Well, it's everything we've just been talking about. A lack of useful knowledge that can be applied in the future to fulfill the basic function of education. The want of a coherent purpose to guide instruction. The lack of a recognized body of knowledge to be taught. Confusion about the relationship between knowledge and thinking, and obliviousness to the learning imperatives identified by science. It's not helpful to bury our heads in the sand and pretend these realities don't exist. Once they're brought into the open, they can be addressed, and we can deal with them. The fate of history education, and possibly even our species, could depend on it. Suggestion: let's do what makes sense. Would it make sense to focus history instruction on knowledge that can be used in the future to inform judgment in human affairs? by providing students with an understandable overview of history, both U.S. and world history, that would allow them to place any new concerns within the context of broader human experience, and by equipping students with concrete knowledge of recurring dynamics of history that might help us to avoid pitfalls and make wiser choices in the future, and by teaching students practical thinking skills for evaluating and using historical knowledge, and by undertaking these educational tasks in ways known to be cognitively effective. Would all that make sense? And could it bring order out of the current chaos of history education? If you're interested in exploring these basic elements of history education in more depth, you might find what you're looking for at futurefocusedhistory.blog or in other videos on the Future Focused History YouTube channel. Best wishes to you, history teacher. May your heart always remain in a good place.